Hello and welcome. We're in a part of the Word of God today that deals with relation between people. We're explaining our way through the Mosaic Law, and we ended last time with some laws that were in the Law of Moses that was dealing with sex between people. And all these laws that deal with relations between people and deal with things stolen and making restitution. These are all ways that God had set up to make sure society functions well, and that society functioned in a good and moral way, and that they are violated at our own peril. Yes, it's true that over in the New Testament, we're not held to keeping the Mosaic Law as a qualification for righteousness. Our righteousness comes through Jesus Christ. But these principles that are back here in the Mosaic Law are universal principles that add a lot. And since most of this law, Steve, is so ignored, that I find that it's good to go back and look at these things, because there's some real good gold nuggets of truth back here that still today help us get along between people. Wouldn't you think?
Yes, and our society, and especially here in the United States, many of our early laws were built off of these, the Mosaic Law that was outlined here. This was kind of the background and backdrop to it, to see where, in just a short, figuratively speaking, 250 years or so, where we are now based upon where we were, even at our particular point in time, shows how fast that once we leave God out of the picture and we don't feel that we're responsible to answer to Him for our actions, where man on his own takes it.
Right. And so today we're going to be talking about some issues that have arisen between men and women in regards to sex and premarital sex and even rape. The passage that kicked us off at the end of our last session was in Exodus 22, verse 16, talked about if a man seduced a woman, then what were the consequences? He had to marry her, or at least take care of her, and couldn't just walk off and abandon her. A similar parallel passage is over in Deuteronomy chapter 22. And so we want to start there today and deal with a question that often comes up, simply because in Exodus 22, it deals with a similar thing. So therefore, since this is such a serious and cruel accusation, then we need to deal with it. And it's a widespread question that comes up today is, does the Bible tell us that a woman has to marry her rapist? And so let's go ahead and deal with that, since it's in these passages here that deal with a similar thing to the one we were dealing with. If you have your Bibles, we're going to start in Deuteronomy and then we'll go back to Exodus. So, but Steve, if you could read, we have here Deuteronomy chapter 22, starting in verse 23. And Steve, if you could read down to verse 29.
If there is a girl who is a virgin engaged to a man, and another man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death. The girl, because she did not cry out in the city, and the man, because he has violated his neighbor's wife. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. But if in the field the man finds the girl who is engaged, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lies with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the girl. There is no sin in the girl worthy of death. For just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is this case. When he found her in the field, the engaged girl cried out, but there was no one to save her. If a man finds a girl who is a virgin, who is not engaged, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are discovered, then the man who lay with her shall give to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall become his wife because he has violated her. He cannot divorce her all his days.
Okay, so let's go back and sort of walk through what this is saying here. Starting in verse 23, it has a passage here where it talks about a girl who's a virgin but engaged to a man. Right there in verse 23, they have sex together. That means lies with her. Then they are to be taken out and stoned. And an engaged girl in those days was considered legally married. Betrothed is some of the translations the old King James word. An engaged girl or engaged man having sex with somebody that they're not engaged to is considered adultery, and that was a very serious crime. That's why they were stoned to death. And it says in the city, because you understand the cities in those days were different than today. The cities were kind of all on top of each other. There's maybe a piece of cloth over the window or the door, people living very close around you. You know, you can hear the people thinking in the next room. There'd be many people around. These would assume that there'd be many people around in a city because you didn't never really got any privacy. It would be a simple matter of crying out to people and could be saved. And so since this happened, it was considered adultery, and therefore they were to be stoned. Of course, a judge would end up deciding that's an assumption in all of this. Then in verse 25, if we look at that, in the field, the man finds the girl and he forces her and lies with her, then only the man shall die. And the assumption there is that it's out away from people. There's nobody to help her. There'd be nobody close by. The girl's innocent and she was forced or raped. So therefore, only the man gets killed for the rape. Again, still have to, the judges would work this out and decide, but that's the law. Then we get to the problem case, or at least the one that draws all the questions, which is in verses 28 and 29. If he finds the girl who is a virgin, who's not engaged, and seizes her and lies with her, and they're discovered, then the man who lay with her shall give the girl's father 50 shekels. She shall become his wife, and he can't divorce her. Now, where the problem comes in is in some of the English translations in Deuteronomy chapter 22, specifically verses 28 and 29, they use the word rape here, and they don't make the distinction between the terms. And so that's what I wanted to kind of do, Steve, is there's some clarity that needs to be brought to the case here about what it's actually saying. And the English is, of course, a translation of the Hebrew. And with all due respect to the translators, some of the translations don't make a distinction in the terms here. What I want to do is to get a little bit technical here in the sense, look at the word here in verse 25, where our New American Standard says, in the field, the man finds the girl who's engaged, and the man forces her. Well, that is the Hebrew word kazak, and in Strong's lexicon, it's numbered 2388, and that word means to overpower physically. In the NASB, or New American Standard, translates that correctly. It's to attack her, right? He overpowers her. He forces her. There's a different word used in verse 28. There, our New American Standard says seizes her. A different Hebrew word, tophas. It's Strong's number 8610. And that word just means to lay hold of or grasp. And so the distinction here is that in verse 25, he's actually raping her. He's forced her. But in verse 28, he's just seized her. He grabbed her. He took her. And the parallel passage over in Exodus, the one we read at the end of last time, Exodus 22:16, it uses the English word seduce. The man seduced her, which is the Hebrew word patha, which was Strong's 6601. So if you look them up in a good lexicon, you'll see the distinctions. And so what I'm building a case for here is that some of the English translations, when they translate Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 and 29, specifically the NIV translation, the New International Version, with all due respect to the translators, they got this one wrong. Deuteronomy 22, verse 28 does not talk about somebody raping somebody. It's dealing with a very similar thing as Exodus 22, verse 16, that talks about seducing. They go and lie with her. They had premarital sex. And so Exodus 22:16 And Deuteronomy 22, verse 28 and 29 are dealing with the same thing. Two people had premarital sex. They do not use the word force, do not use the word rape. And so the Bible is not teaching that a woman has to marry her rapist. What it's saying is that if they have premarital sex, they have to get married. That's what it's saying. If we just compare English translations and even do a little bit of homework looking at the lexicons, then you'll be able to tell the difference. So comment, Steve. There's any, because the reason I bring this up is because it's so egregious, especially to women that have been attacked in the past.
Doing these word studies is beneficial. Sometimes, especially whenever you come to something that is that you want to look into a little bit deeper, look at the specific words that are being talked about there and what their meaning was in the original language.
And so we approach all of these things in our day from a sex-saturated society, and since we've totally lost the idea that premarital, at least the world has, totally lost the idea that premarital sex is a wrong thing, and that sex should be preserved for marriage, which is the Christian thing to do, it's the biblical thing to do, then we lose the seriousness of this. That's what it's talking about. We view these things from a view of our modern thing, and we've lost the idea of approaching it from a moral standpoint, that the man has an obligation to a woman if they have premarital sex. These principles here are actually truly built to protect the woman, to keep her from being taken advantage of. I have seen in recent times video testimony of women who bought into the idea that we can play around, men and women can play around before marriage, have all the sex they want, no consequences, play the field, just have fun. And I remember this one video that was online that this woman was about 35, 36 years old, and she was crying bitterly because of her past. And she was saying, 10 years ago when I was in my late 20s, I was playing around, I was having sex, we were having fun, but here I am, 35, 36 years old. The good men don't want me anymore, and I can't get a date, and I'm facing a life of not being able to be married to a good man. They're not interested in me. I'm probably never going to have children. This woman was crying through her tears saying this, and she was facing a life of growing old and being poor and dying alone. And she was crying about that. Well, that is the pain. If we see these laws here and people take them and twist them because of their agenda, and it ultimately causes the problems that we're seeing today, which is people having all these problems because they totally ignored the biblical laws about sex. And if we just follow these principles here, and again, it's not saying a woman has to marry a rapist. What it's saying is that premarital sex is a very serious crime, and we need to purge that from our society and only have sex in marriage. And that way, we end up with strong families, and we end up with less poor people, and we end up with less people in tragedy, and we end up with a lot more happiness. And so, Steve, that's why I see such a tragedy today, is because people take these things and say, okay, we can just ignore all these biblical morals, and it ends up having a worse problem.
Yeah, and we mentioned it last session, so let's mention it this session too, because listeners or viewers might not watch the previous one, or maybe haven't listened or seen the previous one either. You mentioned that it's protection for the woman. Well, people might say, well, what about the man? He gets to do whatever he wants. No. It's also a consequence to the man. Hey, you took this illegal action, and you're going to marry now, and you're going to start a family. And what it does is it puts him in a position where if he does it again, now that he's married, guess what? Now he has committed adultery. And all the law related to adultery now applies to him. So no, it's not that the woman is treated one way and the man another way. It's made to the point that no, the man is going to have to start a family.
Okay, so let's go back to where we were studying in Exodus chapter 22, and we'll continue on from there. Exodus 22, verse 18 says, "You shall not allow a sorceress to live." Not allow a sorceress to live. Now, he sounds pretty severe here, Steve.
Yes.
So why would God be so clear and so short and so blunt about sorcery?
Well, this isn't, let me tell you what this isn't. This isn't a sleight of hand, somebody that's doing sleight of hand tricks, maybe that we would call an illusionist today. This is a person who is in the occult, what we would refer to as the occult. They're reaching out and trying to contact other spirits, evil spirits from the other world, which by default means that they're into working with other gods or working with other evil spirits, so to speak. And so this is something that is completely God doesn't want. The first commandment was, I'm a jealous God, don't worship any other gods before me. So here this sorceress person is doing it. They're in the midst of the camp. They're doing this, not doing it by themselves. They entice others to get involved with it. And before you know it, it grows into something where they're being led away from worshiping God.
Right. And so the Bible has no tolerance for the occult. God has no dealings with it at all. We should stay entirely away. One of the terms that the Bible uses is a familiar spirit. These are people that regularly contact forces or voices or powers from that are supernatural, that are not of God, or any kind of casting of spells, or any kind of supernatural powers outside of God, any type of fortune telling or getting information from outside of ourselves and God, then the Bible universally, categorically condemns all of that. No question. And again, that's why the Bible here says, you shall not allow a sorceress to live. These are things we do not deal with. Then next, verse 19, whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. Steve, I used to wonder why we would have to have commands like that. But given our modern degenerate society where there's somebody in society that accepts anything and everything, then it's really hard to get shocked anymore. And we actually need commands like this.
Well, and also in this study here, that the Hittite code did prohibit sex or lying with goats and sheep, but they didn't prohibit it with horses or mules. And so once again, this is God giving a law or prescription to his people to set them apart from the other nation. There was this being practiced among some of the other nations in some form or fashion.
So now look at verse 20. He who sacrifices to any god other than to the Lord alone shall be utterly destroyed. And again, God is very exclusive here. Very exclusive. Here's a question, Steve. Why would God demand that people only worship him? Why would he demand you can only worship me? Because that's what he's saying.
Because he is the only God. He is the God that created everything. All these other spirits that the people are worshiping, they're not gods. If it actually is a spirit that they're worshiping, they were created by this God, Yahweh, the God that is working with them. There really truly only is one creator, one almighty, and there is no other. Everything was created by him. So it makes sense and logical sense that he should be the only one to be worshiped.
He alone is worthy. And he made this very clear. Remember, in this very book, we have all of the power demonstrations against the Egyptian gods and against the Egyptian magicians. And so he proved his worthiness and his power, and he has brought Israel out of slavery. And he says, because of that, you will only worship me. It's not bragging if it's fact. It's only the case if God really is as powerful and worthy as he is, then it's not wrong to demand people recognize the worthiness. The true God is indeed worthy of our worship.
And this particular verse here is not just about believing in another God. He says sacrificing. If you're sacrificing to another God, you're serving that other God. You're doing something on behalf of that other God because you want some sort of, you're asking for something from them to provide to you, whatever. But God wants to provide the things to us and to the Israelites there. And so he wants them to come to him and ask him to provide things for them and take care of them. I mean, that's the ultimate.
Moving on to the next one. Look at verse 21 through 24. If we look at that, those sections say that no wrongs will be allowed against strangers, widows, or orphans. And it goes through 2 or 3 things there. And it's a categorical, you shall not afflict, or some of the translations say mistreat or take advantage or wrong strangers, widows, or orphan. God expects all people to be treated well. All people to be treated well. And he takes this very seriously. These were categorical commands. You will not mistreat these people. And he says, look at what he says. He says in there, he will take the life of anybody that violates that. He says, I will take advantage of you. I will destroy you. And so God takes treating people, other people well, very seriously. We will not take advantage of people. We will treat morally. So these laws, there's enough of the specifics in the Mosaic Law to deal with specific issues, but then there's also these categorical commands that says you will treat people well. Then moving on, verses 25 to 27 says that God prevented charging interest to poor people. He prevented charging interest to poor people. This prevented wealthy people from taking financial advantage of those who would not be able to pay it back or pay back the loan. And in our day, we have loan companies that are much more sophisticated than this, and they all the time take advantage of poor people. In fact, there's storefronts in our cities and our towns for the specific purpose of making loans to poor people that and charging them high interest, taking advantage of them. God says do not do that. He will not allow it.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that if you purchase a house and you have a 30-year loan on it, that by the end of you pay all those 30 years that you've paid 3 times the value of the house? Are you saying that that's taking advantage of the owner?
Oh, not only that, but people, what ends up happening is the people who are, in our day, the less able to pay, they charge them higher and higher interest, just exactly the opposite of this, where God is saying if they're poor, don't charge the interest. What ended up happening in culture is people would only loan if you could work it back off in 7 years. Either pay back the loan or you could pay your time as a bond slave and work it off in 7 years. So even up to not all that many years ago, loan companies in the Western world would only loan mortgages for 7 years.
And why was 7 years significant in regards to the Mosaic Law? What happened after the 7th year?
After the 7th year was the Sabbath year that we'll get to here in a little bit, and all the loans had to be forgiven.
Yeah, so it makes sense that you wouldn't want to loan the person something more than what they would be able to work off in less than that deal, because then you'd have to forgive the rest of the loan.
And what that did was keep people from taking advantage of poor people. And we're so sophisticated, we take advantage of poor people in our culture. But if we would just do it God's way, then the poor would have a way to live a decent life, or at least a better life than what they have now. But one of the reasons we have so many poor people, and it's not getting any better, is because we've ignored all these principles back here. We charge higher and higher interest rates to poorer and poorer people and ensure that they stay poor. Now, keep on going down. Verses 25 to 27 talks about charging interest to poor people. If we look at 28, you shall not curse God, nor curse a ruler of your people. And it's a categorical again. It says you shall not. God is worthy, as we just said a little bit ago, God is worthy and will not stand for rebellion. He will not. You will not curse God. God will deal with sin. It also says here, Steve, to not curse the rulers, not curse the rulers. And that is even if they are deserving of curses, because every generation, every people group, and every country seems like has some rulers that are just not very good, and the people complain about them. And in our day, we have no shortage of poor leaders. It's easy to curse the leaders, but God says here, don't do that. So why is that? Why do you think he would say, give this command here, even though knowing that there's going to be bad leaders? Especially if you look at the future of Israel that God knew. He had a long string of poor leaders. So why would he command the people not to curse a leader, even if they're a bad one?
There still needs to be some semblance of order and law and order. And while the people, the rulers might be bad in one area, they might be good in another area. So overall, it's the way that God had set up the system to operate, and that there were consequences to the rulers as well. If they were going to be a bad ruler, they were still going to have to answer to God, because they're in the law. They're told how they're not supposed to take advantage of people, how they're supposed to rule the people. So there's going to be a consequence if they were bad. But this set the stage for the people to follow the law and order so that there could be order.
Right. And this principle plays itself out over in the New Testament. 2 different times over in the New Testament, there are commands to obey the king, to obey our rulers. And that was in a day where the civil government was much more oppressive than it is today. They were telling us, be good citizens. Be good citizens. Don't start rebellions and things like that. Don't constantly talk against the rulers. In our day, we're blessed with being able to vote, and we're blessed with being able to address issues. There may be a wicked ruler that we can speak against. This isn't saying don't deal with a problem case ruler. No, in our day, if we have corrupt rulers, then we can deal with them. We can charge them with crimes, and we can speak publicly and say that this person is violating the law and we need to take care of that, or they're not making good decisions. But what this is talking about, don't curse the ruler, is like the grumbling. It's the constant beefing and complaining around you and your neighbors and them. It just creates discontent. And that, what does that do? It kind of creates a society that doesn't want to work together, which is exactly what we have.
And any ruler, good ruler, bad ruler, mediocre ruler, there's always going to be somebody that has some sort of a grievance or something to grumble about. And where you might see the ruler and grumble about him about one thing, and I say, no, I don't see that that's a problem. And then there's another thing that I grumble about the ruler, and you say, well, I don't see there's a problem. There's always going to be somebody grumbling when you have a large body of people. This just sets it and says, look, nobody grumble against the rulers.
Now look at the next couple of verses, verse 29 and 30. Those deal with offerings to God, offerings to God. And they say that we should not delay in giving offerings that are due to the Lord. And it's, again, command of the people saying, do not delay in giving offerings that are rightfully due to the Lord. So a question, Steve, what would be the application for that today? I mean, we have churches and we give money in churches. What these verses were saying is don't delay in giving the money, the offerings that are due, the sacrifices to the Lord. How would we apply that to us today?
Well, we should take from the very first off the top of whatever salary that we're making and give that very first portion. First thing goes to the Lord.
Yes. And again, don't delay in it. What always happens with because humans have human nature. And what does human nature do when we have any little crack of an excuse about, oh, well, I'm having a financial problem this week, or had an unexpected expense or something, and so I'm going to wait a little. I'll still give it, you understand, but I'll wait a little. What ends up happening if we allow ourselves to think like that?
Well, usually something else always comes along in order to cause a problem.
There's always something. There's always some immediate pressing thing that happens, some wildfire disaster, something popped up in my life that I can convince myself it's okay to shortchange God and not give him what he's due. So the offerings and the tithes, our time that we give as offerings, and the worship we give the Lord, we need to do it today. We don't need to wait, and there'll just be another excuse later, and ultimately then we'll get to the end of our life, and we will not have given God what is due. Give him what is due now, because we do not know that we will have tomorrow. We need to respect and give God what is due today. And then next, look at the end of verse 29. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. Firstborn of your sons. As Christian parents, we should all take this very seriously. Our children, we should be very conscious and very focused towards dedicating them to the Lord, teaching them the ways of the Lord. We should proactively, consciously, actively teach them the ways of the Lord. Because if we don't, they won't learn it. They won't learn it. We should be very proactive in dedicating our sons and daughters to the Lord. Wouldn't you say, Steve?
Yes, and that's what I think this is talking about. It's talking about dedicating to God, right? It's setting them aside or setting them apart for God's purposes.
Right. And so then at the end, the very last verse in this chapter, one of my favorite quirky little verses is, you shall be holy men to me, therefore you shall not eat any flesh torn to pieces in the field, or you shall throw it to the dogs.
Yeah, we would say don't eat roadkill.
Don't eat roadkill. Don't eat roadkill. That's what it's saying.
That's what we say in East Texas. Don't eat the roadkill.
Right. And so obviously dietary law, don't do those kinds of things. If you don't know how it was killed, then you need to be very careful about eating it. Probably a good place to wrap up for now. That's at the end of chapter 22. And there's still more good things that we can reason through next time. We'll be doing that next time, and we trust that you'll be here to join us.
Thank you for watching and listening. May God bless you.